Would you please pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So as I mentioned before, church this week was our Synod Assembly. Again, the church kind of works with congregations being at the bottom and then synods being the next step up, a bunch of congregations, and then synods get together for the national church. And in fact, the national church will be having assembly here in August, right here in our fair city of Pittsburgh. And so for the Synod Assembly, as we just had these past 3 days, it meets every year, and all the pastors of the Synod get together, and representatives from every church get together. And again, we hear speakers, we hear reports of all the social ministries and agencies of the church, those places where all of our benevolence dollars go to hear the action that happens from that money. We join in fellowship and worship, and generally we just do the business of the church, things like electing a new bishop or re-electing our faithful bishop. Again, I could probably stand here before you and talk for an hour or so about all the many wonderful things I saw and heard over these last 3 days. And maybe I'll do that. There's a couple that want to go to the Pirate game today, so maybe I'll just give a really long sermon. However, this past assembly got me thinking and praying about our gospel lesson for this week. There's one poignant connection I saw from the assembly and this gospel that I just read a few moments ago. As I mentioned, one of the things that happens during the assembly is we hear about these ministries that we support through our benevolence to the Synod and to the national church. And this year we heard from one ministry in particular that really got my heart. It's a relatively new ministry right here in our city of Pittsburgh, and it's called Abiding Hope. And Abiding Hope is a ministry to care for the poor and homeless in urban Pittsburgh. Deacon Chris Rotella is at the center of this ministry, and she works part-time as a chaplain for Mercy Hospital, and she serves the rest of her ministry where people are in need. Not really a building, not really a certain place, but lots of places, lots of people. She goes to churches sometimes, but more often than that, she goes to bus stations, public restrooms, under bridges, abandoned buildings, the streets, or wherever people are at. Chris's ministry is about accompaniment. She walks with people. She listens to people. She hears their stories. And she told amazing and emotional stories to us about those people that she accompanies. And as I heard her stories yesterday, I kept thinking about the gospel for this week, right? I was struck by Chris's stories, and I was struck by the woman at Jesus' feet in our gospel. So back in the beginning of that gospel, we have this meeting between Jesus and a Pharisee named Simon. The first thing that ought to jump out to us in these sorts of stories is the fact that this exchange is probably not going to go well for our dear friend Simon the Pharisee. These guys are the great law officials of the Jews. If you had a question about how to be right in front of God's eyes, you went to a Pharisee. They'd tell you. They would tell you what to do, how to live, what was right and what was wrong. They were not to be countered. You didn't say the Pharisees were wrong. I mean, they were specialists in the law. And we know that Jesus doesn't always abide in the law, right? Especially when it stands in the way of God's love, compassion, and equality. And so we read that Jesus gets invited to this Pharisee guy's house to eat together. Again, no doubt this is not just an evening of wining and dining with two good friends. We're already 7 chapters into Luke's gospel here by now, and Jesus has ruffled some feathers in the Jewish hierarchy. Chances are, this Pharisee, Simon, wants to do some questioning and trapping of Jesus. However, before Simon can even break out any of his questions he's no doubt been preparing, there's this woman at Jesus' feet, right? And she's weeping and washing them. In fact, it says that this woman is washing Jesus' feet with her tears. Now the Pharisee jumps up and kind of says, this woman's a sinner. We don't know exactly what her sin is. But he implies that she has no business being at that table or at the foot of that table, washing anyone's feet or caring for Jesus in these ways. Jesus, his rebuttal is sort of this mini parable about greater forgiveness and lesser forgiveness and who would be more grateful. And his implication is clear. All are sinful. All are in need of forgiveness. And though the more sinful person is going to get that forgiveness thing a whole lot better than the person who isn't as sinful, or at least who doesn't recognize their sinfulness as much. It's a good point. I could preach about that point. I could keep going on that point if I wanted to. However, as I imagine this scene in my head, and I think about this last week and these words from Chris Vertella yesterday, I can't get past this woman. This poor, desperate woman. This woman who has dragged herself in from the streets and now kneels at Jesus' feet so she can wash them. And not only does she wash his feet, but the fluid in which she does her bathing comes from her eyes, from her tears, her sobbing. So emotional, so overcome by the moment and the opportunity to be in the presence of God that she weeps. She weeps so much that her tears are enough to wash Jesus' no doubt disgusting and dirty feet. Feet that aren't dirty like my feet or your feet in our comfortable shoes, socks, and sandals. Feet that are dirty because they walk through deserts and dirt. Feet that are dirty because of a lifestyle that we cannot understand. And it's those feet that this poor woman clings to. No doubt smelling the odors of the road on Jesus' skin, the odors of the countryside as she buries her face into those feet in shame. Weeping as she is in the presence of God and finds herself unworthy. So broken, so vulnerable, that all she could do is weep. Man, that's awkward, right? Yes, awkward? I mean, that's the sort of conclusion we come to in this moment, right? I mean, when we think about this story, probably you like me, we're picturing ourselves sitting around the table beside the Pharisee Simon and Jesus. And we picture ourselves looking down at this pathetic woman who's so overwhelmed with her own junk, her own brokenness, that she's just weeping and sobbing and uncomfortably washing Jesus' feet with her tears. She's drying them with her hair. We imagine ourselves at that table, and no doubt we are trying to block her out, trying to look the other direction so we don't get caught up in that uncomfortability, trying to ignore the sounds of her sobbing, uncomfortably shifting in our seat back and forth, maybe turning our backs to her, hoping that Simon the Pharisee will be the token jerk for all of us and tell her just to get lost. Maybe Jesus will say something nice and encourage her to go on her way now. But what if we got this story all wrong? I mean, really, what arrogance is it to assume we're sitting at the table beside Jesus and the Pharisee? Maybe we're one of the other Pharisees, right? That's who would be sitting at that table with Simon, Jesus, the one non-Pharisee amongst a bunch of Pharisees. Perhaps we ought to hear this story and see ourselves through the eyes of the woman. I mean, can you imagine that? Think about that for a moment. Think of what it would take in your life to drive you to that emotion. Because the reality is, we are called to be like the woman. We are called to get on our knees at the feet of Jesus and our neighbors. We are called to recognize our own brokenness and fall to pieces in our failure. And it's at the feet of Jesus that we, just like this woman, are then forgiven. And then we are called to be at the feet of our neighbors and the world. Again, as I was listening to Deacon Chris Vertella at the Synod Assembly, I kept thinking to myself how overwhelming her ministry would be. To regularly go to places that are uncomfortable, to regularly be with people that are just a mess, struggling, to be with people regularly who are sick in body, mind, and spirit. I sat there and I thought to myself, I am thankful that that was her ministry and not mine. But then this story broke me. The story of this woman at Jesus' feet reminds me that this is not just Chris's ministry. It's my ministry. And friends, it is your ministry too. You are called to care for those in need, especially those most in need. Is it uncomfortable? Yes, very uncomfortable. Darn right it's uncomfortable. Jesus regularly goes, though, to the people and the places that make people uncomfortable. He regularly does things opposite the way people expect. That's probably why this Pharisee asked him to dinner, because Jesus has been doing these things over and over again, eating with unclean people, touching unclean people, healing them. Jesus is a rabble-rouser and he's doing the wrong things. And Simon, the good Pharisee, wants to correct him of those things, to condemn him for caring for certain people. When people are emotional, we are not called to walk away. We are not called to leave people on their own and sort out their stuff. We are called to love and care for them. When people need help and we can offer help, we aren't called to simply pray for them and hope their problems sort themselves out. We are called to do something about it. Friends, look around at our house or our Aliquippa community. There are people weeping, and we are called to love and care for them. We are not called to live and let be. We are called to get mixed up in each other's lives. We are called to be community. Friends, may you be uncomfortable. May you be driven out of your comfort zones and find yourselves at the feet of Jesus all messed up. And may you relish in that moment. Amen.